Forbes India presents India's growth drivers, powered by Barclays Private Clients.
Hello and welcome to our special show, Forbes India presents India's growth drivers, brought to you by Barclays Private Clients. Our theme for discussion today is Indian families' emerging trends in succession planning. Because when it comes to succession planning, it appears that Indian families are falling short. There is a lot of talk about it, but when it comes to implementation, it's been said that just 20% of Indian family-owned businesses have actually started the process of succession planning. So what's holding our Indian companies back? Is it a trend particular to India itself, or is it comparable to what we are seeing in the West? And what are those key areas that companies need to look at? What's the key rationale behind succession planning? So many questions. Let's turn across to our panelists to go ahead and get some of those answers and introduce them to you on the show. We have with us panelists joining us on the show, starting with Mark Tucker, who's Director, Global Head of International Wealth Advisory, Barclays Private Bank. Haigreve Khaitan, Senior Partner at Khaitan Company. Girish Vanvari, Founder, Transaction Square. Pallavi Joshi Bakhru, Partner, Private Client Services, Grant Thornton Bharat Limited. Poonam Mirchandani, Director, India, Barclays Private Clients. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today for this in-person session. It's always great to talk about something, especially something as vital as succession planning, particularly in India. I mean, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of articles written about how Indian businesses especially have been falling behind when it comes to succession planning. Some of the big names have planned well, but perhaps it's not evenly spread across the board.
The way Indians look at it is a little more complicatedly. They look at the family, the passing on of wealth, the succession of transition of wealth, and they're also looking now very consciously at the management. As you know, many Indian companies are founder-driven. The families have become very complicated. There are brothers, there are their children in the family, and there's a more and more realization that there is a premium to institutionalization of companies. So the successes which we see with big business houses who manage to institutionalize, to show a path to the investors that, you know, there won't be a family dispute in the future, and there's a clear succession plan as to who will take over, who will be the MD, who will be the CEO, and how will the family run the business, is getting a premium. So I see more and more of my clients actually not only looking at trust wills, but also adding the dimension of how they want to run the company in the future, how they want to pass on the control. Do they want to have outsiders? Do they want to create roles for the family?
So what you're saying, Girish, is Indian companies more and more are thinking about that. They're realizing the importance of doing so.
Undoubtedly.
Okay. Pallavi, I think it's one of your articles that I read recently. You've said that actually Indian companies have been faltering a little bit. And I'll just back that up with a study that I read, which said that only 20% of families have considered and implemented a succession roadmap. First, would you agree that, one is the discussion, then there is the implementation. Where are we at? And if at all you feel that we aren't moving at a quick enough pace, what's the factor that's holding companies back?
So, statistics are what they are, and, they're not mine. So I sort of rely on that. But I think the conversations have started for sure. I think it's because of the scale that companies have achieved and they realize. And, the larger ones, which are listed anyway, are subject to a lot more probity and need to meet the standards as far as succession planning is concerned, not just for the family alone, but for the business, just to the point that Girish was making. And I think that's a very important aspect of succession planning as well. But I think what is increasingly happening is that a lot of mid-market companies, which is our sweet spot in India, are looking at external funding. You want to be ready for a private equity player to come in. You want a strategic partner to come in from a technology perspective. You have to give them that comfort of knowing that, you've got all the loose ends of the family nicely tucked so that, when it comes to business, nothing from here spills over. So I think, coming back, that's driving a lot of people towards conversations. And as transactions happen and businesses want to scale up, they are setting up governance charters. They are looking at succession planning very, very seriously, both when it comes to the family and when it comes to the business as well. Because, you can't, business can't succeed unless you have good professionals running it.
Twin factors. One is, of course, as the businesses become more complex, they also want more funding to come in. It's become a market necessity almost that they want to go in for that. But yet, Haigreve, let me toss the same question across to you. We won't take any names here, but we've seen some messy sort of quarrels play out. And this is, since we're talking about large corporations, ostensibly corporations who have had the time and planning and funds to talk about succession planning. So what typically do you think, has gone wrong, or what are those pitfalls that family-owned businesses can and should avoid?
I'd really say that, as families grow larger, and if you haven't planned in time, then the potential of a dispute arises because there's a conflict as to who will be in power, who will be in control, and also in terms of, say, voting control, succession to the shares, and these issues can arise. So one big factor is, the next generation. When it comes into business, there is a reset. And there is a sort of a very good playground for the older generation. There is balance of power. As soon as the next generation comes, there is a reset. And I see really in our Indian context, it's really the nephew or the niece who comes into the business who can't get along with the uncle or aunt, And I add the niece and the aunt because I think we are a different society now, and a lot of women, rightly so, are also in business and part of the succession planning. So I think it is one big factor is succession to the next generation, and as soon as that happens, it leads to a lot of differences. Maybe because of style of management, maybe because of aspirations, and maybe because of control and power.
Some great points, I think, and you've really touched the nerve there. Poonam, would you like to respond to that or add to that?
Today, succession planning is very, very important, right? And when you're talking about succession, while everybody wants to talk about it and there is a lot of noise which is happening, but you'll be very surprised that when you're having this conversation, more often than not, the first concern would be that if I speak about succession, there's the fear of mortality which comes into play. No one wants to talk about succession. And it's counterintuitive if you ask me, right? Because succession is about seamlessly transferring your wealth to the next generation. And here you have families who have such huge amount of wealth, know they should do succession, but they are just very worried. The moment they'll talk about it, mortality will be around the corner. So I would say that yes, there is definitely a long way to go in terms of the entire planning process. We just need to do that start, the kickstart.
It's a lot of emotion tied in. Yeah. There's also a lot of power plays. Mark, are Indian companies very different in that sense?
It's hugely emotional. Let's not lose sight of that. And I would say Indian companies, no two companies are identical, we know that. But companies in India, companies elsewhere in the world, they are essentially the same thing. They're constructed the same way. They have three core components. You have owners and shareholders of companies. You have family members who may or may not be owners of the company, and you have business workers in that company. And they may be family members, they might not be family members. But the needs of all of those three components are very, very different. So for example, owners and shareholders, they're driving profit and growth. That's what they're looking to do. Family members, they're looking generally for more longevity and preserving the business for future generations. Whereas business workers, especially non-family members, they're important. If they're critical to the business, their aspiration is essentially, can their career objectives be fulfilled? So businesses would generally fail if there's not a clear understanding across those three segments. And that is the same whether it's in India or any business, around the world. So
you're saying succession planning in itself is a very emotional decision, is where the founder or the chairman has to sit down and plan for the road ahead?
Absolutely, it's very emotional. And where I would say there probably is a bit of a difference from Indian businesses, Indian companies compared to some in the Western world is there's a lot being prepared or understood about business governance, so board composition. I think everybody understands that in a company context, but it's family governance which is really important because that's the emotional aspect. Mm-hmm. It's the key things that the family are trying to achieve in terms of getting their values broadcasted. It's the
right. So there's the emotional and there's the economics of it, because clearly it makes good business sense. So Girish, Are we beginning to see a little shift in that balance? I mean, to Pallavi's point that, it actually is great for investors into a company if they do have a succession plan in place.
First of all, Indians as a community don't let go. So you want to be the chairman till you die. You want to own the shares till you die. And there's a big fear that if you let go, you will not be relevant. So that is the culture which everybody is groomed with. And take a second example, like, I see a lot of people, like a person having two sons, one very active in the business, doing very well, second not so good, but the father will never take a decision. He'll never upset his second son. He'll try and balance the two, try and make sure both are relevant. He won't take that decision in his lifetime, saying, okay, this guy will be the MD. He will make joint MDs, he will make so many different things, and in his lifetime not have that unpleasant thing of creating a path. But still people are talking about it. Still it's a delight to know that, oh, I'm exploring preparation of charters, I'm exploring succession planning, I'm talking to so many people, understanding how it works, because there's a huge FOMO. In every party, every discussion is like, have you done trust wills? Have you done a succession plan? Okay, let me study it. So there is a lot of interest, but the execution has been something which we could do more in the Indian context.
Pallavi, just asking you to respond to this point, and since you brought up the whole issue of, the economic rationale, and for instance, listed entities, and we've got some really large, conglomerates who are listed as opposed to unlisted entities. Do you find listed entities who have a responsibility to their shareholders? Do you find that in that sense, those set of companies in any case have to walk the path and have some sort of succession plan in place as opposed to unlisted, or there's really no difference between the two?
No, there clearly is a difference. And as I said, the imperatives are very different. When you're a large listed company, you don't have a choice. You have, and you've reached that scale because you've probably had that succession planning in place, particularly when it comes to the professionals who head the business. And as I said, there's a lot more probity. Your board will question you. I mean, it's one of the fiduciary responsibilities of the board to make sure that there's good succession planning in the business, because otherwise you're not going to add shareholder value. So like I said, there are a lot of imperatives for a large listed company to sort of drive succession planning on the professional side of things.
But is that really happening? I mean,
it does happen. In all fairness, it does happen. Boards are very sort of interactive. In a lot of boards, you'll find they actually mentor some of the senior management people. So, and they demand visibility to know, okay, what's the second line of command looking like? Do you have enough depth of talent? Is there a pipeline of talent? I think a lot happens on the professional side, but it gets a little touchy when it comes to the family. So you could be sitting on a board of a large listed company and, everything is sort of in place on the professional side of things. But when it comes to the family, it's maybe just a nudge or some words of advice. There isn't very much you can do to precipitate action.
So professional management, it's okay to take a look at, keep the plan, but family should not be touched, even if, or rather it becomes a sensitive point to approach. And that's what we want to try and understand.
There is no statutory requirement for the board to do that. Like I said, a board has a fiduciary responsibility towards its shareholders.
Right.
So you will reach out and say, look, I want to understand where's the talent, what's our sort of game plan if, something happens to somebody, who's going to take over, whether it's a planned succession or an emergency succession, there needs to be a backup plan. When it comes to the family, these are friendly nudges. You can probably tell them that, somebody else did this and this is what good looks like, which is what I call nudges. You don't sort of ham-handedly come down on them. And I think families are quick to pick up these days. They know what good looks like and, there's a benefit for it. And in large listed companies, believe you me, the market sort of punishes you when you don't do things right.
In fact, let's drill a little deeper. And Haigreve, we were talking about the various, there's been a growing interest in something known as private trusts, as well as a will. I think Girish just mentioned a will. I mean, when we talk about succession planning, what are those various elements? I mean, is there something wherein, the family can still retain control or gradually hand over control? Just explain to us, what are the various forms in which succession planning can actually take place?
Yeah. I know, I think you raise a very sort of a wide question, and, succession planning can have and has to have different elements. Right. One element obviously will be a will, under which when one passes away, one sort of bequeaths assets to your successors. And whatever is in your sort of personal hands will still be under a will. The reason why trusts are in vogue and have been very popular in the West and now in the East and in our country as well is because you can actually transfer assets and control during your lifetime, and then choose how much of control you want to retain, how much of control you want to give, divide between economic rights and control. The point which Pallavi mentioned and Girish mentioned, that look, people are concerned that if they do something, does it mean that, look, it's the end? Are they thinking of mortality? And that is something the Indian family can well do through trusts. Another big advantage is that everybody knows, or you can actually discuss and communicate the trust provisions in advance. You're not leaving it to the will being opened after a person passes away and possible disputes and differences in the family.
So this seems almost like an ideal solution in terms of a trust. Poonam, perhaps you'd like to, come in here, because that whole issue of control and, I don't want to give it away, you can still maintain that. But yet companies are still holding back. I mean, why do you think that is?
So, we spoke about fear of mortality. There's also the fear of loss of control. While one says that you don't have to give up control, going back to the point which Girish mentioned about those two sons and the patriarch, we've seen examples where sons have become 50 years, 60 years, and the patriarch is there 18, 90 and still is holding the key for everything, right? So it's also that the fact that they'll create the trusts, exactly like Haigreve mentioned, but they will not fund the structures, they will not activate the structures out, right? So creating a dormant structure doesn't really help the cause, right? One needs to, again, move the assets in, and that again goes back to the fear of loss of control. Though one says that, okay, you can build in the provisions, somewhere the Indian mindset still needs to go through that change, and that phase is still going on, whereby clients say that, okay, we have created the structure and we'll start moving assets into the structures, whether these are, revocable trusts, which is a superior version of a will, right? Because in a will, what happens is it comes into existence post your lifetime. There are disputes, there are differences. But on the other side, you can do whatever you want to do. You can tear the will and write a new will. A revocable trust is one where you can do the same thing, right? But it then becomes automatic. The differences, the issues, the disputes all go off.
So there is a very important tool, if I may call it,
It is.
which is there for patriarchs or matriarchs, for their sons and daughters to really, gradually transition into their business. But Girish, I was reading that the cost of actually setting up some of these trusts, and this is particularly perhaps for small and medium enterprises, they might feel that the entire exercise by itself is very expensive. And, in India, we like to just, have these unwritten sort of agreements, verbal agreements that, you'll get this, and whatever. Nothing's actually put down in black and white. Is cost a big deterrent as well?
It is actually. If you see any write-up on India, Indians are great lovers of real estate, gold, and then you have liquid assets and shares. That's the sophisticated investors. So if you really look at real estate, which really forms large part of patriarch or matriarch wealth, transitioning that into a trust structure has stamp duty issues, and these are actually costs which are dry costs, because you're not selling an asset. If you sell an asset, pay stamp duty, it's understandable. You're getting money, you're paying money. So that's a cost to it. So there are deterrents in the form of stamp duty. There are deterrents in the form of different kind of analysis. And today life has become very complicated also. So I interact with Poonam on so many things which Barclays works on, and people have children all over the world. People have people studying. Some people are actually having brothers and sisters in different parts of the world, and understanding what this means in different jurisdictions also leads to additional complications. That, gifting something to a trust here should not take implication somewhere else in the world in terms of a gift tax. In India, it's exempt, but each thing has to be studied, analyzed, and and there are ways around it. So it's not that there is a showstopper, but you need to analyze all the implications before you actually go ahead and do it.
Okay, so it is complicated, especially when the business is spread far and wide across, but clearly trusts are something that many companies should be looking at in order as part of their succession planning? Because at the end of the day, Haigreve, you need business continuity, right? You want the business to continue across generations. But do you think for companies who are unable to plan in this manner, you find that in your experience that business continuity, especially in terms of the intergenerational handover, really becomes an issue? I mean, we have had companies who are flourishing. I mean, we've got some of the largest conglomerates here in the world sitting here in India who've been flourishing for almost 200 years, and because they have been able to do that handover successfully.
Oh yes, the companies and families which don't do it face this challenge and risk. And I'd really separate the board level succession and a shareholder level succession. So board level succession, a board can still plan how to select the new managing director, CFO, KMPs, and that can be done. There's a fiduciary responsibility, the board will do it. But if your shareholding is also not well planned in terms of succession, ultimate control lies there. And if you don't do that and there's a dispute in the family, then the votes are divided, control is divided, and then you don't know who's driving the company. And ultimately, there will be wealth erosion, or there can be wealth erosion. So it's very important to do both sets of planning.
One of the issues, and we've had this example of the father with the two sons, and let's talk about sibling rivalry. And Pallavi, that's possibly one of the biggest factors which has derailed succession planning or held back companies from really growing further. Sibling rivalry, even for companies which have been listed and they seem to have a fantastic sort of history, yet seems to be unavoidable, particularly here in India. Why is that?
So I don't think it's sort of anything specific to India. I mean, sibling rivalry is a very natural phenomenon, and people are the same everywhere. But I think, to the point, rivalry is not bad unless it's at the cost of the other person. Okay, it's like conflict. The way I look at it, conflict is not bad because it just means a contrarian view. But if the conflict becomes a dispute, then we have an issue. So when you have multiple members in a family who are participating in a business, there will be points of difference. But you need to create a mechanism where they air those differences, but when they come to the board, they are one voice on the table as a shareholder, as a significant shareholder. And I think that's why a family governance charter sort of gains a lot of importance in terms of creating that environment where different points of view can be aired, can be discussed. You can even agree to disagree. But, that conversation needs to happen, and a governance charter allows you to do that. So all the more reason, you need to build trust, you need to have communication. I think communication is the sweet sauce for everything in a family.
And it's also one of the missing links, right? Would you say?
It usually is, because, when you're not engaging in sort of meaningful conversations, you're not saying what you want to say, then you're only sort of, adding to the undercurrent and, all the other things that follow. So I think communication is an important piece, and a governance charter allows you. There's a whole framework around how do you have those conversations, how do you moderate them, how do you allow people to give their points of view. You either convince or get convinced, or as I said, you agree to disagree.
Again, to address the fact that not all family members are part of the management, right, Poonam? I mean, some are just shareholders who hold stake and they want to see that dividend continuously growing. The others are actually actively involved in management. I mean, how do you resolve the various sort of different demands and aspirations of family members?
The way at least I've seen happening, it's very important to identify what's the interest of that individual family member, right? If you have only the economic interest as your go-to thing, the fact that the person who's running the business, if they run the business well, will automatically achieve the objectives you're looking for, which is a higher rate of dividend. So it's very important to have the demarcation whereby the person who's running the business is given that kind of authority and control to make that profit, right? One objective which we could do is to ensure that there is a limited amount of dividend pre-agreed. Saying this is the minimum amount which will be given out to you. It could be structured through different forms. It could be structured in the form of a payout from the company itself, because a family has multiple asset classes, right? When you put a structure in place, you have your business assets and you have a non-business assets. Right. When you have a business assets, the strategy will be growth, which means redeployment of the money into the business itself. And or it could be in terms of payout, because like a listed company, they have to pay out money to the dividends for the shareholders. So are the family members as shareholders. So one could bring that balance in by ensuring that a portion of that comes out from the non-business investments.
But again, it comes back to Pallavi's point that, have that agreement
having an agreement, having transparency, because so long as you have the transparent mode, so Pallavi mentioned communication, right? It's also important that you have the transparency among the family members, the one who are running the business and the one who are not, as to how to achieve that goal.
Haigreve, what are those emerging trends? Now, families know these are critical issues at hand. So what are you seeing in terms of emerging trends as far as, family businesses are concerned in India? Which way are they going?
Well, emerging trends is to have clarity and put something in place earlier than later. And you spoke about wills and trusts. Another trend is to have a clear shareholders agreement, maybe in addition to a trust or an alternative to a trust, where between the different family members, how they will vote, how they will actually control, who will be in management, how economic interest will be defined, and have a shareholders agreement with clarity. So many a time families are very reluctant in giving up ownership of shares to a common trust in the family. They want to feel the shares in their own hands. They want to feel the wealth.
In fact, Mark, that's perhaps not been the experience in the West. I mean, I know a lot of large American, family-run businesses who actually, there are different categories of shares. Some have chosen to put their shares in a trust. Would you say in that sense, there's something for Indian companies to emulate or learn from?
I think in many, many ways. It is a lot more developed, I would say, certainly in the Western world. But we've talked a lot about just governance generally, and a couple of points I just want to really pick up on is that I think it's really, really important, whatever succession plan you put in place, it actually fits the need of the business. So governance is more important if you've got a multi-generational business model that's got 3 generations and aunts, uncles, siblings, parents, whatever it may be. That is where governance is absolutely critical. But I think conversely, you have some businesses, they could be one generational businesses. Your founder owner has got 100% of the shares, is controlling everything, making all the decisions. The need for governance and complex governance is probably not needed in that scenario. So getting a founder owner like that to actually implement a succession plan is very unlikely, because there's not the anxiety or the need to put it in place. So the 2 messages I would really just highlight, certainly from experience of Western families, are make sure the governance fits the requirement of the situation you're dealing with.
Is there really a timing at all, Pallavi? I mean, isn't now, right now is when all companies should start if they haven't already been doing that?
So I think it does matter where you are in that sort of path,
right,
to sort of putting all these checks and balances in place. And everybody will have that sweet spot when they think this is the right time to do it. And invariably now you'll find the reason why it's gaining a lot of currency is also because the next generation has gone abroad, they've studied, they've come back, they're coming into the business, they're demanding more clarity, they want a little more freedom in terms of what they want to do if they're going to be part of the family business. And I think this is the right time for businesses in India to set up those checks and balances, because once the business becomes really large, then the horse is bolted. You can't change things then. Already given shares to different members of the family, it's very difficult to convince them to now put it into a trust. But as a patriarch, if you put the shares into a trust and says, look, it's like the Rockefeller Foundation.
Right.
And this is now going to this is a legacy we've created. So your personal assets, whatever gets distributed to your heirs or whoever else you want to sort of will it to, but a legacy that you want to sort of leave behind, which usually is, a large company that you've set up, a listed entity. You put those shares into a trust and, let that legacy continue.
Okay.
But it's not a one-time exercise, and that's really, really, really important. So it's great to start the journey, but circumstances change. The business might evolve.
It's something that should be continuously revisited.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And family circumstances change. People move and relocate to different countries, so that could necessitate the need to actually restructure whatever succession plan you put in place. Right. So it's an ongoing evolution where certainly we think families need to be advised by banks with their lawyers, their accountants, as a team approach really to help them navigate all sorts of issues.
Poonam, I mean, what are you picking up? Are now companies more willing to listen and actually implement? I think Girish mentioned the point. It's wonderful to talk about succession planning, but to actually implement, and in some of the forms that both Pallavi and Mark have been talking about.
I would say implementation is still a long way to go. There is a limited amount of limitation.
Is it still the same old issues of mortality, not wanting to give up power?
I think it's also the fact that I don't want to give up the assets. Yes, but there's a need for a push to come in. The push could be different. It could be, for example, Pallavi spoke about strategic investors coming in. So that's the push for you to then move those assets into the structure, because you know that now we have somebody else coming in. So let's have our common decisions. Usually, especially for unlisted businesses, the boardroom and the dining room, it's the same thing, right? The conversations are no different.
Because to Mark's point about governance, governance is an issue we've spoken about at length.
Yeah.
Indian companies haven't had a stellar record. Girish, what would you like to add to what Poonam is saying? And particularly when it comes to issues such as, governance, and to really ensure that succession planning is part of that.
The normal Indian behavior is to do something when pushed to a wall. So,
has the pandemic pushed them to the wall?
I'll give you an example. There is a fear and there is an opportunity. So I see a lot of people who deal with me reacting to things out of fear. So if two of your relatives go away, let's make a will. He passed away. Tomorrow something can happen to me. So people are reacting out of fear. If I went out and presented to somebody, look, if you did this, your valuations will go up, your governance will go up, you will get better recognition in the financial world, in the employment community. The immediate reaction will be like, oh, look at these top 5 and they're doing very well, and it's a one-man company and that guy is doing everything and it's all there. I think it's time to transition into the positive mindset of that all these things getting put to be right is going to create more value. And that recognition is beginning to come in. And I hope it just continues, and the next 3-4 years it's far more far-reaching. Right now it's happening out of fear.
So let's keep all that fear aside, and I think we want to have closing comments, because as I said, we can really delve deeper and deeper into these issues, but we want to understand why it's important in the here and now for Indian companies. What are those emerging trends? So I'm going to ask for closing comments. Haigreve, let me start with you. How do you see sort of as Indian companies evolve, family-owned businesses evolve? Would you agree with Girish that they're looking more and more at the value side of things as opposed to just reacting from an emotion, whether it's fear or some other, from an emotional point of view?
No, I'd say definitely they're looking at the value side, and I'd really put another term to fear. I'd say there are certain triggers, and those triggers have hastened and gotten people to think proactively to succession planning. And whether it is in relation to family wealth, whether it's in relation to company shares, whether it's at the board, and these are triggers. The trigger may be another family dispute. A trigger may be, parents not being looked after. A trigger may be a sudden COVID death. A trigger may be marital problems. And in our social sort of circles, if people are actually experiencing this, these are triggers, and that has caused corporate India and family businesses to change.
Absolutely. So I think much more longer term planning. Pallavi, actually, Mark, I'll come with your final point of view. But Pallavi, from here on, I mean, you've mentioned a lot of factors which are holding Indian businesses back. But what's really changing in their favor? Would you agree with what Haigreve has said?
I think I completely agree. The triggers have been sort of numerous, whether it's on the personal side of things. I think it's a way of protecting wealth. If you're sort of ring fencing wealth for a child who's, walking into a marriage and you're not too sure how things will turn out, it's preservation of wealth. And I think everybody is now increasingly realizing that, we are all custodians of wealth. Set up the next generation in such a way with structures, whether it's through wills or trusts, that, they are also protected. And that's the whole reason. I mean, we spoke a little earlier about wills and trust. These are all instruments for ensuring effective succession.
Absolutely.
So I think it's happening, and it's a very, very good trend that people want to protect a family's wealth.
Okay. Poonam, what do you see as the emerging trends from here on?
So I would say the emerging trends would be start as early as possible, right? Because when you are starting early, everybody is on good terms. They are ready to come to the table to speak, to have that conversation, to have that engagement. The moment a trigger, ensures that you're coming on the table, there will always be this discord, right? And there won't be that openness of an individual to come and talk and find a solution out. So the earlier, the better.
Okay.
That's the trend which I'm looking
So
at.
start today. Girish, I want to hear one more insight from you because it's been fascinating about the kind of insights you've shared with us.
So the trends in the future will be family offices, big ambitions, big plans, and a structured approach. And it's going to be like a BlackBerry to a Apple. Like it's all changed. So next 3-4 years, you'll see suddenly a different scenario. It's going to be very rapid. What I see with my clients.
Mark, a final sort of world view from you when it comes to the emerging trends, both in India and across the world, since you're meeting with clients across the globe.
I mean, look at reality. Families that have retained and preserved wealth over multiple generations have all focused on succession planning. It's as simple as that. So it is important, and those that invest the time will succeed from it. So in addition to that, I would say, as we've discussed, putting the right type of governance is important. Having the right team of people to support families is important. And one last comment as well, which we haven't really touched on, but I think it is important, that sometimes trying to force a business from one generation to the next isn't the right outcome. Sort of helping families actually realise that there isn't a succession for the family business, and exiting a business and reinvesting proceeds into different ventures might be just as good advice as trying to force a business from passing from one generation to the next. So lots to think about.
On that thought, thank you so much, Mark, Pallavi, Poonam, Girish and Haigreve for joining us for this fascinating discussion and insight into the world of succession planning, what's holding back family businesses, and also why the need of the hour. It's imperative that companies sit down today, families sit down today and discuss the road ahead. We hope you've gained some insights, whether you're a business, big or small. Thank you for joining us on this special show of Forbes India presents India's Growth Drivers, powered by Barclays Private Clients. Thank you so much for watching.
Forbes India presents India's Growth Drivers, powered by Barclays Private Clients.